So when you look at fantasy novel or maybe even historical fiction on screen, the way monarchies collapse is usually this huge, like, single event, isn't it? You picture the guillotine, the big castle siege, maybe a revolution. This hero suddenly takes down the evil king. It feels very dramatic, very quick. And, it gives you that satisfying sense of immediate change. Boom, new regime.
Yeah, it makes for a great story, absolutely. But the historical reality, it's often far less cinematic. I mean, sure, you have those dramatic revolts. They definitely have. But for every one of those, there are loads of royal houses that they didn't go out in a blaze of glory. They kind of suffered a much quieter death. They were simply, outpaced. New systems came along, representative government, modern bureaucracy, things that just worked better for a more complex world. Their power didn't really explode. It just eroded away.
Right, erosion. And that erosion, that leads us straight into the main thing we want to unpack. And what we're calling the monarchs dilemma. It's this constant pressure, political and cultural grind that any hereditary ruler face. How do you actually hold on to your inherited power, your traditions, while also meeting the needs of a society that's getting more and more complex all the time? Because giving power away risks your authority, but not giving it away. You risk becoming totally irrelevant. And maybe that's even worse than irrelevant way.
And that's our mission, to synthesize this whole dilemma. We're drawing from, proper historical analysis, but also looking at political science ideas, the kind of fictional world build. We're going to try and deconstruct the foundation, political, the ideological, the cultural stuff that actually holds them. And then we'll look at the three ways those foundations, asking that key question: what happened when the legal system of power that just doesn't match up anywhere, the real power, the de facto? Okay, so to really get how a monarchy falls, you first have to understand it's called the political engine of how it stands up. Monarchs, kings, queens, emperors, they're not just people. That's crucial. They are deeply interconnected. They're built on foundations, right? Interlocking ones. Political assumptions, economic ones, religious ones, ideological justification, all the stuff that makes their rule make sense.
And historically, probably the biggest, most powerful assumption was that power came directly from the land, controlling the resources right there. We're talking divine rely, right? Or how the church propped up the whole feudal system, the economy, loyalty. Yeah. If you control the fields, you control the food. You control the people. Simple as that. Almost, yeah. But those foundations, even though they almost always involve land before industry, they can look wildly different depending on the culture, the religion. Yeah. Think about the philosophical justifications. The Thai monarchs. Yeah. It operates under Buddhist cosmological ideas about the king's role and responsibility. He's often seen as this sort of enlightened leader providing moral guidance, almost a Dharmaraja. Compare that to the Christian assumptions behind, say, the British monarch. Historically, that involved a much more direct link to God's will, protecting the faith. So that difference right there shows you the foundation isn't some universal thing. It's specific. It's deliberately built for that culture. And when we focus on land, it's important to realize the kind of power you get from land can be really different too. Mm-hmm. It's not always just about, growing grain or mining ore. Take the Vatican. Structurally, it's a monarchy, right? The Pope is the absolute ruler of Vatican City. And the Catholic Church globally owns a huge amount of land. Estimates are massive, maybe 177 million hectares worldwide, but it's incredibly spread out. Exactly. It's not like one big feudal estate pumping out resources in one country. Instead, the Vatican's land schools, hospitals, churches, it provides this dispersed institutional influence. Its power isn't from controlling resources in one place. It's more like soft power working through the huge global institution. And that actually helped the church survive when lots of feudal monarchies fell, because its power base was adaptable. It wasn't just tied to borders. Yeah, and this is why I think looking at fictional examples is so useful sometimes. World building lets you get really creative with what these pillars actually. It proves power doesn't have to come from a wheat. And you could argue the more abstract that power source is, the more precarious the monarchy might be if that source gets threatened. Totally. Look at the Elder Scrolls universe, the Khajiit. Their whole physical development, which basically sets their social caste, their place in society, it depends entirely on the phases of the moons when they were born. The rarest alignment produces a single spiritual leader for all Khajiit. So their power is tied to the stars, to biology, not land. If the moons just stop, the whole system, the leader's authority, it collapses. Or think about Frank Herbert. The emperor's position, it's hereditary, but his actual authority, it leans on several really crucial you've got the Spacing Guild, right? They have the absolute monopoly on faster-than-light travel, massive economic and then there's the Bene Gesserit, that powerful female order using mind power, marriages, basically managing the political and, genetic landscape of all the great houses. Right. Those are like incorporated factions, almost external groups whose cooperation is just essential. Or in the Witcher universe, you see smart rulers incorporating powerful magic users like Triss or Yennefer. Instead of seeing them as a threat, they bring them in as high-level advisors. Mages become another pillar holding up the system, providing intelligence, military power the king's normal soldiers just can't match. So the question for any monarch, real or fictional, is always, what specific pillars give you leverage in your system? And that question leads us right to the real catalyst for the monarch's dilemma.
It kicks off when civilizations advance, when they get more complex, more interconnected, richer, usually because of new resources, new tech, and crucially, new ideas, intellectual capital. The very definition of power, fundamentally.
Yeah, the wealth stops just flowing from controlling the land right next door, or the iron mine. It starts coming from specialized trade, from complex finance like stock markets, from building huge shipping companies that cross borders, from new institutions like universities churning out skilled people.
Exactly. We're shifting from an agrarian economy towards a commercial one and then eventually industrial. And that change means suddenly a merchant. Maybe he doesn't own a single acre of noble land, but he controls half the ships bringing silk from the east. He's got way more liquid cash, more potential influence than your average feudal baron. He can fund armies, maybe even prop up governments. And this just speeds up with big technological jumps, the printing press, steam power, the internet. Any big acceleration in tech transforms the economy and creates totally new power.
Just think about today, the modern parallel. The internet means tech giants. They're founders. They're de facto power centers, aren't they? They control the infrastructure of how we communicate, how we buy things. And even the most powerful governments have to deal with them, accommodate. So as trade grows, as more people get educated, you inevitably create this new class of wealthy elite. And they don't just have the money, they have the time and the intellectual tool to look at the existing government, the de jure one, and think,
they're the new power class. And the old monarchical system just wasn't built to handle them.
Okay, so this shift leads us right into the political crisis for the monarchy.
Yeah.
And it really boils down to this clash between two types of power. First, you've got de jure power. That's the legal authority. Who has the right to rule according to the law, tradition, maybe a religious decree?
And then you have de facto power, which is the functional, real-world influence. Who actually controls the money, the military force, the information? Whose ideas do the educated people follow? Think about some minor European royal today. They might have a strong de jure claim to some throne that vanished centuries ago, but they have practically zero de facto power in London or Paris now.
And that distinction is absolutely critical. When those de jure structures, the traditional monarchy, its rules no longer reflect where the de facto power actually lies with the new merchants, the bankers, the educated, mobile elites. That's a friction point. That gap creates huge social tension, political unrest, and often, outright conflict.
The pillars holding up the monarchy start to get hollowed out from the inside. Let's go back. The emperor's position relies heavily on the Sardaukar, right? His elite troops, supposedly that military monopoly is a core de facto pillar. But then House Atreides builds up their own force, one that's shown to be comparable to the Sardaukar. Suddenly, the emperor's lost that monopoly, the pillar's crumbling, and what does he do? Instead of trying to maybe integrate this new power, House Atreides, he chooses suppression, destruction. And that decision, driven by fear of losing influence, leads directly to his downfall, even if it doesn't immediately result in, say, a democracy.
So facing this kind of irreversible shift in real power, the monarch basically has a choice of strategy. Option A is like radical suppression. Try to stop progress, technological, economic, social using force, which is super risky, expensive, and often just pushes that de facto power underground where it festers and becomes revolutionary.
Or option B, which is much more common, usually takes longer. Incorporation. This is where you see parliaments being created, or councils, some kind of formal body. The monarch tries to bring these new wealthy elites into the system. The goal is to placate them, maybe tax their wealth more easily, keep them on side. You try to keep the monarch at the top, at the center, by giving away, a calculated, hopefully small amount of specific power.
But the moment you open that door to sharing power, even just a crack, it's open forever, isn't it? That's the slippery slope of constitutionalism. Once you create something like a parliament, even if you only meant it as an advisory group initially, it immediately becomes a forum for criticism, for formal debate, and crucially, for people trying to set down permanent legal limits on what the monarch can actually do.
And that debate's been raging for centuries. It's really important to remember. The whole idea of the absolute monarch, that was often more theory or maybe a later invention. Even medieval kings were constantly bumping up against the power of their own nobles, the church. They weren't truly absolute in practice time.
Yeah, exactly. Look at medieval France. You had these incredibly powerful nobles, like Charles the Bald, Duke of Burgundy back in the 1400s. He had his own armies, huge wealth in his reign. He didn't really treat the French king as some absolute boss, more like a powerful rival, maybe first among equals on a good day. The king's power often kind of stopped at the board of the duke.
And those nobles were always ready to push back to enforce limits. When we talk about Magna Carta, that cornerstone of English people forget King John basically tore up the first version from 1215 almost immediately. The barons, the powerful lords, they had to force the issue again and again. There were actually 6 different versions of Magna Carta issued over about years.
6 versions. Why so many?
Because the nobles kept having to make the king re-accept limits on his power. Limits on taxing them without their agreement, often hidden in things like scutage, paying cash instead of sending knights, or limits on just grabbing their property or locking them up without due process. Every time the king tried to claw back some specific financial power, the nobles basically forced him to sign another version. It wasn't really about giving the common person a voice back then. It was about the existing de facto power, the aristocracy, putting formal limits on the de jure leader, the king.
Right, that constant push and pull. And that tension, that's what ultimately erodes the monarch's actual political authority over time. You see a perfect fictional version of this in Game of Thrones with Cersei Lannister's downfall. Her de jure power as Queen Regent just completely ignores or even antagonizes the real de facto pillars, like the Iron Bank, who hold all the debt, and the faith, the religious establishment that has the people's loyalty.
So when the bank backs her rival, Stannis, and the faith literally arrests her, the whole political system just collapses around her. Because her legal title was totally disconnected from where the real money, military potential, and cultural buy-in actually were. A monarch just can't afford to ignore reality for long.
Okay, so we've talked about society getting more complex, but that complexity creates another huge problem for the monarch. The state itself, the government apparatus, starts getting way more powerful. We're talking around the 16th, 17th centuries. The state starts doing massive national-level things that were just impossible in the old loose feudal setup.
Yeah, like permanent standing armies, not just temporary levies called up for a fight. Standardized national tax collection that's actually efficient. Managing currency, interest rates, having permanent diplomats for colonial stuff and trade deals, setting up national banks, maybe even standardized schools. These are huge projects that need tons of resources and really high levels of bureaucratic coordination.
And this leads to what we can call the second dilemma for the monarch, or the state paradox. See, if they try to stick rigidly to the old ways, decentralized, feudal methods, they're going to get crushed economically or militarily by neighbors who do adopt these complex, centralized state functions. But managing this national scale complexity means you have to rely on professional bureaucrats, highly trained appointees, experts in finance or logistics, and critically, you need a predictable, formal system of administration, one that works despite the personal whims of the monarch, not because of them.
Right. So the monarch faces this choice. Either you hold on to your personal power to make decisions on a whim rule arbitrarily, like maybe your father did, and risk your whole nation fading into irrelevance as others advance, or you give up that personal arbitrary power. You become part of a bigger system, the modern state, which can wield way more collective power on the world stage, even if you personally have less direct control day to day.
Exactly. And the move towards something like parliament, even though it looks like it makes the monarch weaker personally, it actually makes the resulting state much stronger because it gives the state machine a legitimate, formal way to raise the huge amounts of money needed and to get buy-in from those powerful merchant and landowning groups in a developed economy.
Which helps explain the rise of what historians call bureaucratic absolutism, right? In places like France under Louis XIV, these powerful kings tried to centralize state power, relying heavily on a professional, sometimes merit-based bureaucracy like the intendants in France. It was an attempt to harness the power of the modern state, but as an alternative to democratic parliamentarian. They were trying to bypass the old feudal nobles and keep power firmly in the king's hands, using this new bureaucratic machine.
Yeah, and the irony there is pretty profound. Bureaucratic absolutism. It was actually quite successful politically at crushing the local power of the old feudal nobles, centralizing tax, military command under the crown. That consolidation, creating the modern centralized nation state, that was a vital step away from feudal. But the system of absolutism itself, it didn't save the monarchy in the long run. The centralized state they built became so complex, so essential, that when the monarch eventually stumped, the bureaucracy, the state structure itself, often just carried on. They just swapped the king for a president or a prime minister by the 17th, 18th centuries. The machine outlasted the monarch.
Which then brings us to the third unavoidable part of this whole dilemma. Internal backlash. The monarch's caught in a dilemma within a dilemma. They need to bring in the new power pillars, the educated folks, the merchants, the bankers to get money to avoid getting crushed by other countries. But the second they try to do that, they face furious opposition from the old guard, the entrenched nobles who benefited massively from the old decentralized arbitrary system.
It's the basic political reality of power dilution, isn't it? When you create new seats at the table, the people already sitting there feel like their own seat just got smaller. It's like the niminism of politics, not in my backyard. People already inside the system. They don't want to let more people in, especially if it reduces their own status or influence.
Right. If the French king decides to call a parliament or set up a powerful council of financial experts, do you think Charles the Bald, that powerful Duke of Burgundy we mentioned, wants to suddenly be just one of the guys, sitting there with a vote maybe equal to some rich merchant from Paris whose grandfather was basically a serf? No way.
His family's prestige, built over centuries on land and fighting, it feels threatened by this new power based on liquid cash and, dare I say it, expertise.
So the poor monarch is stuck fighting on two fronts, trying to manage the demanding new elites coming up while also dealing with the powerful, angry opposition from the traditional aristocracy who feel like they're losing out. It's a mess. Okay, so that political decline, that slow drift where de jure power gets disconnected from de facto power, that's only one way monarchies die. The other two often happen alongside it, but they point to something deeper, like a collapse of the story the monarchy tells about itself. We're talking ideological and cultural death.
Right. Ideological death is basically when the philosophical reason, the justification for the ruler's power, just stops making sense. If the monarch rules by divine right, this is the slow crumbling of that, maybe driven by secularism, science, people learning about other ways of thinking. People just gradually stop believing there's any fundamental difference, genetic, spiritual, whatever, between the monarch and just an average person.
And historically, yeah, that ideological erosion was often tied directly to the church. Was the monarch's power and their spiritual role were often tangled up together, but then you get the decline of religious monopoly, the Reformation, Christianity splintering, secular ideas rise, and suddenly that religious justification gets stripped away. I mean, when Henry VIII just leaves the Catholic Church and makes himself head of a new Anglican church, basically, so he can get a divorce.
Yeah.
That fundamentally has to diminish the sacred aura of the crown, right?
Oh, absolutely. If the king can just declare himself head of the church to suit his personal agenda, then the source of his divine authority isn't some ancient, immutable thing anymore. It's political. He used religion as a tool, sure, but in doing that, he showed everyone that the ideological foundation was actually negotiable, which probably accelerated secular thinking.
And this kind of deconstruction, taking apart the myth, it can even be deliberate, sometimes even in fictional settings. In Samantha Shannon's Priory of the Orange Tree, the whole monarchy rests on this ideological pillar that the queen's bloodline is vital to keep some dark entity locked away. But the queen herself decides it's time to move beyond monarchy. So she intentionally deconstructs the myth, tells her people, look, my family's authority was only needed for a specific time, 1,000 years, and that time is up.
Wow, okay. So she basically gives the founding myth an expiry date. That's clever. And the really crucial thing there is when you deliberately unravel the ideological basis of the monarchy, you're often pulling apart the whole social and political fabric that holds that society together. If the monarch's power came from, say, a rigid, religiously backed caste system, then challenging the monarchy means you're inherently challenging the caste system too. That affects everything who marries who, land rights, education access.
And the rise of a more educated middle class, plus fast technological change that just fuels this kind of critical thinking, skepticism, and eventually, ideological deconstruction.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting. Even if a monarch loses all their political clout and the ideology behind them crumble, they can still survive purely as a cultural institution. This is cultural survival.
Yeah.
They stick around as symbols, right? Symbols of national unity, history, maybe neutral figures above the political fray.
Exactly. The Thai monarchy is a really good example. It's been through massive political changes, upheaval, but the king remains an incredibly powerful cultural symbol. Even now, you see his picture everywhere. He's still on the coin. And the actual Thai word for civil servant still literally translates to servant of the king. That connection runs so deep culturally that even quite radical political movements have to be very careful how they talk about the monarch. And keeping that cultural relevance can be a really strategic move, sometimes even for outside powers or new political systems. Like after World War II, the U.S. forces occupying Japan had this big debate. Should they put Emperor Hirohito on trial as a war criminal?
I remember reading about this.
And they decided against it. They figured the cultural and, frankly, spiritual authority around him was just too deep-seated in Japanese society.
Right. They understood that just removing him could create this huge vacuum, maybe chaos, or worse, from their point of view, maybe a swing towards communism, which is obviously completely against monarchy and traditional power. So what they did was force him to publicly renounce his divinity. They dismantled the ideological foundation, but they kept him as a cultural symbol, a symbol of stability. They basically used that embedded cultural influence to help guide Japan towards democratic reforms, making the transition smoother. Clever in a way.
So cultural death only really happened when a nation actively and successfully creates powerful new symbols for itself. Symbols that completely replace the monarchy in the public image. The French Revolution is the classic example. They didn't just boot out the royals, they intentionally tore down statues, destroyed coats of arms, and they created Mary, this fictional woman embodying the new revolutionary values, liberty, equality, fraternity. She was deliberately female, often shown bare breast, a real contrast to the old male-led, buttoned-up aristocracy. It gave the country a new identity.
And you see this cultural battle today in post-colonial. Often the former monarch becomes becomes a symbol of collaboration, colonial power. Like the Nguyen dynasty in French Indochina, their authority was basically hollowed out by the French. So when they finally abdicated communists, they were finished politically, culturally. For many Vietnamese, they just represent.
We even see this kind of cultural wrestling match playing out right now in Commonwealth, like the ongoing debate in New Zealand, whether to take the king's face off there. And the discussion often revolves around replacing it with purely local symbols, maybe significant historical figures like the Maori leader Tita Kawara, who advocated for peace, or sometimes just symbols of local nature, like their famous fat, flightless, useless kalapo bird, which I think is actually the kakapo parrot.
Yeah, the kakapo. A truly magnificent creature, actually. But the fact that the debate seriously includes replacing the monarch with this giant, ground-dwelling, endangered parrot, it shows just how far the cultural relevance has potentially faded for some. It's fundamentally a fight over what story the country wants its money, its symbols, to tell about itself going forward. And for some, the monarch just isn't part of that future narrative anymore. So when a monarchy finally does collapse, or it cedes enough power to become, say, constitutional or republican, we often have this quite rosy picture of democracy, don't we? Everyone suddenly gets an equal say. But the historical reality, the transition phase, is almost always dominated by the old power structures, the de facto powers trying very carefully to preserve their influence within the new system.
And the clearest sign of that maneuvering is usually who gets to vote first. It's almost never everyone at once. It's nearly always the people who already held power. The big landowners, the wealthy merchants, maybe certain urban elites. It's basically them trying to keep the old hierarchy going, just translating their land-based power into a new vote-based currency.
Absolutely. And expanding voting rights. It's rarely done just out of pure goodwill. It's almost always strategic. Look at New Zealand back in the 1860s. They gave gold miners the vote in 1862. Now, these guys didn't necessarily own land in the traditional sense, but their economic clout, their importance to the colonial economy, was massive. So bringing them into the system incorporation was seen as necessary for stability and, let's be honest, tax revenue.
And then just a few years later, 1867, they set up the 4 Maori seats in Parliament, giving the indigenous Maori population representation. Now, on the surface, that looks like a purely progressive move. But the history is really complex. It was tied up with the Crown's efforts to buy up communally owned Maori land, to push towards individual European-style land titles.
So it was a strategic move with multiple aims. Provide some necessary representation, yes, but also facilitate deeper assimilation into the Crown's legal and economic frame. Or look at the American West. Women in the Utah Territory got the vote way earlier than most other places in the U.S. But it wasn't because Utah was suddenly this beacon of feminism. The dominant Mormon church leadership believed that these newly voting women would overwhelmingly support Mormon political interests, specific defending the practice of polygamy.
Ah, okay. So it was a calculation.
It was a calculation. And when it turned out the women didn't always vote the way the church hierarchy expected, their right to vote was actually taken away, again, by the U.S. Congress a few years later. It was strategic enfranchisement and then strategic disenfranchisement.
So the point is, who gets the vote and when? It's often this really brutal negotiation. It shows you exactly which old power pillars are fighting to keep their influence in the new political game.
And this need to accommodate different powerful factions is exactly why new democratic systems often end up with layered You mentioned that fantasy world, Amber, inspired by the game Europa Universalis 4. The emperor there isn't elected by just everyone. He's elected by specific representatives from key influential groups. Elves, halflings, dwarves, bankers, mages. The structure of that election tells you precisely which groups the state's crucial de facto pillar, the ones that must be kept happy to maintain political.
And that layered sort of factional approach, that's basically the reason we have bicameral systems, right? Upper and lower houses in so many governments today, they're usually designed to represent two fundamentally different things, which often means deliberately overrepresenting certain established interests.
Exactly. Like in the U.S., the House represents population size, but the Senate gives every state equal power regardless of population. That ensures that geographically spread out power, often linked to land or specific state interests, still has a strong voice against population. The UK House of Lords historically had clergy, hereditary nobles, later life appointees, acting as a check on the elected House. Ireland's upper house, the Seanad is specifically designed to represent major sect farming, universal labor. It explicitly moves away from pure one person, one vote to make sure key economic pillars have a direct.
So the crucial question is always, which specific powers did the monarch actually cede and to which specific body? If the lower house gets control of taxes, but the upper house, maybe full of old nobles or appointees, keeps control over declaring war, well, that tells you where the friction points are going to be in the new system.
The old powers rarely just disappear. They just find new ways to sit in the new arc.
And we can actually pull all these threads together using that fictional Momopolis example from the source material. Over 10 generations, the decline of the Momopolis monarchy is like a perfect case study of this slow, methodical erosion we've been talking about. It starts when the monarch, facing a huge trade deficit, brings merchants and magic users onto an advisory council, which, surprise, surprise, later becomes a formal parliament.
Mm-hmm. And the ideological foundation starts wobbling almost right away. People start asking, is the royal blood actually magical, or was that a story? Then the monarch, feeling the pressure, creates two houses. A lower one based on how much tax you pay, and an upper one for the traditional nobles and military, which of course causes immediate friction. The nobles are annoyed that city merchants suddenly have a vote equal to theirs.
And slowly, bit by bit, the monarch loses key power. Control over taxes goes to the lower house. The power to declare war goes to the upper house. The final political nail in the coffin comes when the kaklu, this hybrid species doing most of the manual labor, finally win the right to vote after a big civil rights push demands they be incorporated.
And the monarch. He tries to rebrand himself as this important ceremonial figurehead and but ultimately he loses on all fronts, political, cultural, and ideological. The Republican movement finds powerful new symbols, a flag, a song, a holiday that completely overshadows the old. So after 10 generations of gradually giving away power, 10 generations of people doubting the whole ideology, the last era just quietly add tires to a small house, and only the historian, the press, the monarch's dilemma defeat them with a bang, but with that slow, steady, unstoppable. Now, while that slow erosion is kind of the standard model, we definitely can pack big. These act like powerful accelerators. They challenge the fundamental assumptions of power in a way that peaceful times and gradual...
Yeah, World War I has to be the biggest example in modern history, right?
Yeah.
It directly led to the collapse of four massive monarchies, the German, the Russian, the Austro-Hungarian, and the Ottoman. A crisis on that scale, demanding that level of sacrifice from everyone. It just fundamentally shakes every existing idea about who holds power and why.
Think about the internal shifts it caused. The sheer pressure of the war effort, mass conscription, nationalizing industries, rationing food, it forced huge immediate changes in both de facto and de jure power. You mentioned women demanding the vote. That's a classic example. Their crucial work in factories and fields during the war gave them immense leverage. The state demanded total support from new parts of society, and those parts then demanded inclusion in return.
And critically, when things go badly wrong on a national scale like that, a single, very visible monarch makes for an incredibly easy target for blame. It's emotionally sad. It's really hard for the average person, facing starvation or seeing casualty lists, to blame some complex bureaucracy or a flawed diplomatic treaty.
But it's very easy to blame Kaiser Wilhelm, who was known to be personally involved in military decisions, or Tsar Nicholas II, whose perceived incompetence managing the war effort became legendary. Even if the reality was way more complex, involving whole system, the person at the very top becomes the designated scapegoat when failure happens. And that just accelerates the ideological collapse. People stop believing the leader is competent, let alone divinely chosen.
War also tends to rip open existing internal tensions that the monarchy was maybe just barely managing to keep a lid on. The external pressure doesn't just challenge the monarch's authority, it can shatter the whole internal network the monarchy relied on.
You see this so clearly with Austria-Hungary's collapse. The war just intensified all the existing ethnic tensions. Slovaks, Czechs, Bosnians, Croats, others who felt they had little stake in keeping the Habsburg Empire going. Once the massive military and political force empire crumbled, and the whole structure just fell apart along those ethnic and national fault. The Habsburgs were left with basically no foundation standing in the rubble.
And beyond just ethnic splits, war and crisis speed up shifts in big ideas too. Economic systems think about the massive arguments between capitalism, command economies, communism emerging after WWI. Religious attitudes can shift rapidly too.
And since monarchs often lean heavily on religion for their legitimacy, these sudden, rapid ideological and economic upheavals just make their position even more precarious. Arguments about divine rights start to sound pretty hollow when faced with mass death and national bankruptcy. So yeah, if you're, say, building a fictional world and you throw in massive war, you absolutely have to think about how that conflict fundamentally reshapes the relationship between the people and the entire state, not just the monarch. It speeds up those ideological and cultural declines that might otherwise take generations. #outro.
Okay, so this deep dive into the monarch's dilemma, it really should give you a much fuller picture of that long, often slow, complex road towards political extinction for hereditary rulers. Let's just quickly recap the main takeaways before we finish up. First, always figure out the real foundations of power holding up your monarch. Political, economic, religious, ideological. It's rarely just one thing, and often involves deals with specific outside groups.
Second, remember the dilemma really kicks in when complexity rises, driven by tech, education, trade. That creates new de facto power centers, and they start demanding to be included in the old de jure.
Third, monarchies tend to die in three main ways, often overlapping. Politically, by losing legal authority to those rising powers, culturally, by becoming irrelevant and being replaced by new national symbols, and ideologically, by losing the philosophical justification for their rule.
4. That ideological justification. It's often surprisingly fragile. Keep an eye on how changes in religion or maybe challenges to caste systems have huge knock-on effects that we can stand.
5th, cultural relevance fades when the nation successfully creates powerful news stories and symbols for itself, like Marianne replacing the king, that push the old monarch into just being a historical footnote.
And finally, the structure of whatever new democratic, that's the ultimate. Who gets to vote first, how the upper and lower houses are set up. It tells you exactly which old powers managed to survive and which specific powers the monarch's eating. Ultimately, the sources we've looked at make it pretty clear. Monarchies were, a workable solution for early ones based mostly on it, but they just weren't really designed for the modern with all its complex and rapid kind of out by the very state apparatus. And that leaves us with a final thought, maybe based on everything we've unpacked, what modern have right systems designed perhaps for an older, less complex, less technological, those might be facing their own version, that slow, steady erosion